Belle Eldridge clutched her worn shawl tighter around her shoulders as the cold autumn wind swept through Walla Walla, Washington Territory. The year was 1875, and the once promising mining town had seen better days, much like Belle herself. At 21, she had already endured more hardship than most faced in a lifetime, orphaned at 16, working her fingers raw at the town's laundry, and living in a small, dilapidated cabin that leaked when it rained. Still, she held her head high as she walked down the muddy main street, ignoring the whispers that followed her like persistent shadows. "There goes Eldridge's girl," Harriet Walsh murmured behind her fan to Josephine Porter, as they stood outside the general store. "Wearing the same dress she's had for 3 winters now. You'd think she'd at least try to improve her situation." Belle pretended not to hear, but the words stung like nettles against bare skin. The women's voices carried on the wind, deliberate in their volume. Their husbands owned the bank and the hotel, respectively, and they viewed Belle's poverty as if it were a moral failing rather than circumstance. "I heard she turned down Chester Williams's offer to work at the saloon," Josephine added with a sniff. "Beggars cannot be choosers, I always say." Belle quickened her pace. Chester's offer had come with conditions that no respectable woman would accept. She would rather wash laundry until her hands bled than sell her dignity. The general store bell jingled as she pushed open the door. Inside, Mr. Harrison looked up from behind the counter, his expression softening slightly at the sight of her. "Miss Eldridge," he greeted. "What can I do for you today?" Belle placed a small list on the counter, along with a handful of coins she had counted 3 times that morning. "Just the essentials, Mr. Harrison. Flour, coffee, and if there's enough left, perhaps a bit of sugar?" Mr. Harrison nodded, gathering her items. As he wrapped the flour in brown paper, the store door opened again, letting in a blast of cold air and the town's most eligible bachelor, Theodore Walsh, the banker's son. "Belle Eldridge," he said, removing his hat in mock politeness. "I see you're making your monthly splurge. Will you be purchasing a new button for that dress?" "I believe I've seen it since President Grant's first term." Laughter erupted from the 2 young men who had followed Theodore inside. Belle felt heat rise to her cheeks, but she refused to show her humiliation. "Mr. Walsh," she replied evenly, "I find it curious that a man who has never worked a day in his life feels qualified to comment on my purchases." Theodore's face darkened. "You'd do well to mind your tongue, Miss Eldridge. My father holds the note on half the businesses in town." "Not mine," came a deep voice from the doorway. Belle turned to see a tall man filling the frame, his broad shoulders dusted with the dirt of the trail, a worn Stetson pulled low over eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. She recognized him as the owner of the Double L Ranch that sprawled across the valley 10 miles outside of town. Lucas Young rarely came into Walla Walla except to sell cattle or purchase supplies. "Young," Theodore said, his voice cooling several degrees. "This doesn't concern you." Lucas stepped into the store, his spurs making a soft jingling sound against the wooden floor. "When I hear a man disrespecting a lady in public, it becomes my concern." He moved to stand beside Belle, and she caught the scent of leather, horses, and the open prairie. There was something reassuringly solid about his presence. "Lady?" Theodore scoffed. "Belle Eldridge is barely a step above the women at the Gilded Lily. Everyone knows her father drank himself to death after gambling away their farm." Belle's hands trembled, but she kept her voice steady. "My father was a good man who had bad fortune. Not everyone is born with a silver spoon, Mr. Walsh." Theodore gave a cruel laugh. "And thank God for that. Some of us have standards to uphold in this town." "Standards?" Lucas raised an eyebrow. "I've seen how you treat your ranch hands, Walsh. Riches never fed a soul if the heart behind them is barren." The words hung in the air, simple yet profound. Belle glanced up at Lucas, surprised by the wisdom in his rough-hewn face. She'd seen him around town occasionally over the past few years, but had never spoken to him directly. He was known to be fair but reserved, a man who let his actions speak louder than words. Theodore's face flushed with anger. You'd best watch yourself, young. My father. Your father and I do business, and we do it fairly. Lucas interrupted. But that doesn't give you the right to belittle others because of their circumstances. Mr. Harrison cleared his throat. Your items, Miss Eldridge. He placed her small bundle on the counter, and Belle reached for her coins. Lucas placed a gentle hand on hers. Add a pound of that hard candy to the lady's order, he told Harrison. And whatever else she needs. Belle stiffened. I don't accept charity, Mr. Young. His eyes met hers, and she was startled by their intensity, deep blue, like the sky just before dusk. Not charity, Miss Eldridge. Just neighborliness. You can pay me back by teaching my foreman's children to read. I hear you've got quite a way with books. Belle hesitated. She did indeed teach reading to several children in town whose parents couldn't afford the school fees, using books her father had saved from their better days. It was one of the few joys in her life. I would be happy to help with their education, she finally said. Lucas nodded, satisfied. Good. They could use some civilizing influence beyond my rough cowboys. Theodore made a dismissive sound. How touching. The dirt-poor laundress and the cowboy who thinks he's better than the rest of us. You deserve each other. Without another word, he stormed out of the store, his companions trailing behind him. Lucas watched them go with a look of mild amusement. Don't mind them, he said to Belle. Men like Walsh measure everything in dollars, never understanding that the truest wealth can't be counted. Belle studied him curiously. You speak like you've read Emerson, Mr. Young. A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Harvard, class of '65, before the war called me home and the open country claimed me for good. He tipped his hat. Lucas Young, Miss Eldridge, though I suspect you already knew that. Belle, she replied, offering her hand. And yes, in a town this size, everyone knows everyone. Not well enough, it seems, Lucas said, shaking her hand. His palm was rough with calluses, but his touch was gentle. Would you allow me to escort you home with your purchases? Belle was about to refuse when she caught sight of Harriet Walsh and her circle watching through the store window with undisguised curiosity. The thought of giving them something genuinely interesting to gossip about was too tempting to resist. Thank you, Mr. Young. I would appreciate that. As they stepped out into the autumn afternoon, Belle felt lighter somehow, as if Lucas's presence beside her was a shield against the town's judgment. And for the first time in a long while, she walked down Main Street with her head held high, not out of defiance, but with a quiet dignity that felt like her own. The crisp October air seemed to soften as Lucas walked Belle to her small cabin on the outskirts of town. Their conversation flowed with surprising ease, touching on books they'd read, the changing colors of the hills surrounding Walla Walla, and the upcoming harvest festival. Here we are, Belle said as they approached her modest dwelling. The cabin was small but neat, with a tiny garden patch where she grew herbs and vegetables during the warmer months. Now only a few hardy plants remained, holding on against the coming winter. Lucas surveyed the place with respect rather than pity. You've made yourself a proper home, he observed. It's simple, but it's mine, Belle replied, a note of pride in her voice. She had paid for the cabin with 3 years of savings, preferring ownership of something humble to renting something grander. The best kind of home, Lucas agreed. I should be getting back to the ranch before dark, but I meant what I said about the reading lessons. Could you ride out this Sunday? I'd send a wagon for you. Belle considered the offer. The extra money would help with winter provisions, and the thought of sharing her love of literature was appealing. Yes, I could manage that. Thank you for the opportunity, Mr. Young. Lucas, he corrected with a smile. If you're going to teach my people, we should dispense with formalities. Lucas, she repeated, finding she liked the way his name felt on her lips. He tipped his hat and mounted his horse, a magnificent chestnut stallion that pawed the ground impatiently. Until Sunday, Belle. As she watched him ride away, Belle felt a strange mix of emotions she couldn't quite name. There was gratitude, certainly, but also a flicker of something warm that had been absent from her life for too long. Sunday arrived with clear skies and a biting wind that hinted at the coming winter. True to his word, Lucas sent a wagon driven by his foreman, a gruff but polite man named Henry Miller. "The boss said to fetch you for teaching," he explained as he helped Belle onto the seat. "My 3 youngsters are fit to burst with excitement. They ain't had much schooling since we moved from Oregon last spring." The Double L Ranch was impressive without being ostentatious. The main house was a sturdy 2-story structure built of local timber, with a wide porch wrapping around 3 sides. Several smaller cabins dotted the property, along with stables, barns, and corrals filled with horses and cattle. Lucas emerged from the main house as the wagon pulled up, his face breaking into a genuine smile at the sight of Belle. "You made it," he said, offering his hand to help her down. "I keep my promises," she replied, accepting his assistance and trying to ignore the warmth that spread through her at his touch. The reading lesson took place in a cozy room off the main house's kitchen. 6 children in total, Henry's 3 plus those of 2 other ranch hands, sat cross-legged on a braided rug, their faces eager as Belle unpacked the books she'd brought. Lucas leaned against the doorframe, watching as Belle engaged the children with a natural ease that transformed her. Her face lit up as she read to them, her voice changing for each character in the story. The children were entranced, and so, Belle noticed with a flush of pleasure, was Lucas. When the lesson ended, the children begged for more, but Belle promised to return the following week with new stories. As the ranch hands' wives took the children for supper, Lucas invited Belle to join him for a meal. "I'm not much of a cook," he admitted as he led her to the dining room. "But Mrs. Patterson, my housekeeper, makes the best beef stew in the territory." The dining room was comfortable rather than formal, with a table large enough to seat 12 but set intimately for 2. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, warding off the evening chill. "Your home is lovely," Belle said, taking in the well-crafted furniture and the bookshelves that lined one wall. "It gets lonely," Lucas replied candidly. "A house needs people to make it a home." They talked through dinner, Lucas sharing stories of his time at Harvard and how he'd returned to take over the family ranch when his father died shortly after the Civil War ended. "I was engaged once," he revealed as Mrs. Patterson served apple pie, "to a Boston society girl. She was willing to move west until she actually saw what that meant." He shrugged. "Can't blame her, really. This life isn't for everyone." Belle thought of her own journey from comfortable farmer's daughter to destitute orphan to independent woman. "Life rarely follows the path we expect," she said softly. "No," Lucas agreed, his eyes finding hers across the table. "Sometimes it leads us somewhere better than we could have planned." The wagon returned Belle to town under a canopy of stars, but the real illumination came from within the warm glow of connection that had been kindled over books, conversation, and shared understanding. As autumn deepened into winter, Belle's Sunday visits to the Double L became a cherished routine. The children's reading skills improved rapidly under her tutelage, and after each lesson, she and Lucas would share a meal and conversation that stretched long into the evening. On a particularly cold December afternoon, Lucas surprised Belle by taking her on a tour of the ranch after the lesson. "I want to show you something," he said, helping her onto his horse and mounting behind her. The warmth of his chest against her back kept the winter chill at bay as they rode to a ridge overlooking the valley. Below them, the ranch spread out in pristine white, smoke curling from chimneys, cattle huddled in sheltered areas. "I come here to think," Lucas said, his breath visible in the cold air. "To remember why I do what I do." Belle understood. Despite the hardships of her life, there were moments like watching a child's face light up when they deciphered a word for the first time that made everything worthwhile. "It's beautiful," she said simply. Lucas was quiet for a moment, then said, "There's talk in town about you." Belle stiffened. "There always is. They say I'm courting you out of pity." She turned to look at him, their faces close in the shared space atop the horse. "Are you?" Lucas's eyes held hers steadily. I'm courting you because you're the strongest, kindest, most genuine person I've ever met. Because when you teach those children, your face shows a joy that makes everything around you brighter. Because you've faced hardship that would break most people, and instead of becoming bitter, you've become more compassionate. Belle's heart hammered in her chest. Is that what this is? Courtship? A smile crept across Lucas's face. What would you call it? I don't know, she admitted. I've never been courted before. Then allow me to make it official. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small carved wooden box. This belonged to my mother. I'd be honored if you'd wear it. Inside was a delicate silver pendant on a chain, a small sapphire gleaming at its center. It wasn't an extravagant piece, but its simplicity and sentiment made it perfect. Lucas, I can't accept this, Belle protested weakly. You can't, he insisted, because it's not given out of pity or charity. It's given with respect and other feelings I hope you might share. Belle touched the pendant gently. It's beautiful. May I? Lucas asked, and when she nodded, he fastened the chain around her neck, his fingers brushing her skin with a tenderness that made her shiver. The pendant rested just below her collarbone, a weight both physical and symbolic. Belle knew that accepting it meant acknowledging that something profound had developed between them, something neither had expected but both now cherished. Thank you, she whispered, not just for the gift but for everything he had brought into her life: dignity, respect, and the gentle awakening of her heart. When word spread through Walla Walla that Lucas Young was officially courting Belle Eldridge, the reactions were predictably mixed. Harriet Walsh and her circle were scandalized, Theodore fumed, and the working people of the town who had always respected Belle's quiet dignity were pleased. Never thought I'd see the day when Lucas Young would settle down, Mr. Harrison commented as Belle purchased supplies at the general store. But I can't think of anyone more deserving of happiness than you, Miss Eldridge. Belle smiled, touching the pendant that now rarely left her neck. Thank you, Mr. Harrison. Life has a way of surprising us. Not all surprises were pleasant, however. As Belle left the store, Theodore Walsh stepped into her path, his face flushed with what appeared to be a combination of whiskey and wounded pride. So you've managed to snare Young, he said, his words slightly slurred. Quite the achievement for a laundress. Belle attempted to step around him. Excuse me, Mr. Walsh. He blocked her way. He'll tire of you, you know. Men like Young might play at being different, but in the end, they all want women who understand their world. And what world would that be? Belle asked, keeping her voice level despite her racing heart. A world where appearances matter. Where connections and family name mean something. Theodore leaned closer. Your kind will always be on the outside looking in, Belle. Don't fool yourself into thinking otherwise. Step away from her, Walsh. Lucas's voice cut through the tension. He stood a few paces away, his expression dangerously calm as he approached. Theodore smirked. Just having a friendly chat with your... What should we call her? Charity case? Social experiment? Lucas's hands curled into fists at his sides, but his voice remained steady. I believe the term you're looking for is the woman I intend to marry. Both Belle and Theodore stared at him in shock. Marry? Theodore sputtered. You can't be serious. Lucas turned to Belle, his eyes softening. I had planned to ask you properly, with more romance than a confrontation on Main Street provides. But yes, I am entirely serious. He took her hand. If you'll have me. Belle's mind raced. They had been courting for only a few months, but in that time, she had come to know Lucas as a man of integrity, kindness, and unexpected depth. She had also come to love him with a certainty that transcended time. Yes, she said, her voice clear and sure. I will marry you, Lucas Young. Theodore made a disgusted sound and stalked away, but Belle barely noticed his departure. The world had narrowed to Lucas's face and the joy that transformed it at her answer. Later that evening, alone on the porch of her small cabin, Lucas properly proposed with a ring that had been his grandmother's, a simple gold band with a small diamond that caught the light of the lantern. "I love you, Belle Eldridge," he said as he slipped it onto her finger. "Not despite your circumstances, but because of the woman they've helped you become." Belle looked at the ring, then at the man kneeling before her. "And I love you, Lucas Young. Not for what you have, but for who you are." Their wedding took place on the first day of spring, 1876. The ceremony was held at the Double L Ranch, with wildflowers decorating the tables and children from Belle's reading lessons scattering petals along the path to the improvised altar. Belle wore a dress of pale blue silk that Lucas had ordered from San Francisco, insisting it was a wedding gift rather than charity. Her hair was adorned with white blossoms, and around her neck gleamed the sapphire pendant, a symbol of where their journey together had begun. The guest list was eclectic ranch hands and their families, shopkeepers from town who had always treated Belle with respect, and even Mr. Harrison, who closed the general store for the day to attend. Conspicuously absent were the Walshes and their circle, though their absence was more a relief than a disappointment. As Belle walked toward Lucas, who waited for her with undisguised adoration, she reflected on the path that had brought her here. The losses, the struggles, the daily indignities of poverty all had shaped her into someone capable of recognizing and treasuring the genuine goodness she'd found in Lucas. "Dearly beloved," began the minister, and Belle felt the words resonate in her soul. Beloved. She was that now, in a way she hadn't been since her parents died. The realization brought tears to her eyes that had nothing to do with sorrow. Their vows were simple but heartfelt, promises to support, respect, and cherish one another through whatever life might bring. When Lucas kissed her as his wife for the first time, the cheers of their assembled guests seemed to echo the joy bursting within her own heart. The celebration continued well into the evening, with dancing in the barn to fiddle music and a feast that showcased the best of what the ranch and the surrounding land had to offer. Belle moved among the guests, no longer the town's object of pity but the mistress of Double L, her happiness evident in every smile and gesture. "Mrs. Young," Lucas said, finding her by the punch bowl and testing the new name with evident pleasure. "May I have this dance?" As he led her to the center of the barn floor, the fiddler began a slow, sweet melody. Lucas drew her close, one hand at her waist, the other holding hers against his chest. "Happy?" he asked softly. Belle looked up at her husband, the words still new and wonderful in her mind. "More than I ever thought possible," she replied honestly. Lucas's smile deepened the creases around his eyes. "This is just the beginning, Belle. We have a lifetime ahead of us." That lifetime began in earnest the next morning, as Belle woke in the master bedroom of the main house, now her home. The early light filtered through the curtains, illuminating Lucas's face as he slept beside her, one arm draped protectively across her waist. Becoming mistress of Double L brought challenges Belle hadn't anticipated. Some of the older ranch hands were initially skeptical of taking direction from a woman, especially one they had known as the town's laundress. The household staff, though respectful, watched her cautiously, unsure of what changes she might implement. But Belle approached her new role with the same quiet determination that had sustained her through years of hardship. She learned the operations of the ranch, studied the account books, and continued teaching reading not only to the children but to any adults on the ranch who wanted to learn. By summer, she had earned the respect of everyone at Double L, not because she was Lucas's wife, but because of her own merits, her fairness, her work ethic, and her genuine concern for the welfare of all who lived and worked on the ranch. One warm July evening, as Belle and Lucas sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, she shared news that would change their lives once again. "I visited Dr. Morgan in town today," she said, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Lucas turned to her, concern immediately crossing his face. "Are you unwell?" Belle shook her head, taking his hand and placing it gently over her still flat stomach. "Quite the opposite. We're going to have a baby, Lucas. Come winter, there will be 3 of us." The joy that bloomed across Lucas's face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains, gradual, then all at once overwhelming in its brilliance. He gathered Belle into his arms, holding her as if she were made of the most precious material on earth. "A baby," he whispered against her hair. "Our child." The news spread quickly through the ranch and then to town. Most reactions were congratulatory, though Belle couldn't help noticing Harriet Walsh's tight smile when they encountered each other at church. "How fortunate for you," Harriet said, her eyes flickering to Belle's waistline. "Children are such a blessing, though I imagine adjusting to motherhood will be quite challenging for someone of your background." Belle might once have been wounded by such thinly veiled disdain, but now she merely smiled. "Thank you for your concern, Mrs. Walsh. Fortunately, love and dedication matter more in raising a child than social standing. I'm sure you agree." As Belle's pregnancy progressed, Lucas became endearingly protective, insisting she rest more and hiring additional help for the house. Belle complied with some of his requests but remained active in ranch affairs, determined that impending motherhood wouldn't diminish her contributions to their shared life. In December, as snow blanketed the valley, Belle gave birth to a son they named James Lucas Young, after both their fathers. The labor was difficult, lasting nearly 20 hours, during which Lucas never left her side despite the doctor's repeated suggestions that the birthing room was no place for a man. "My place is with my wife," Lucas had stated firmly, holding Belle's hand through each contraction and wiping her brow with cool cloths. When James finally arrived, his lusty cries filling the room, the look of wonder on Lucas's face as he held his son for the first time was a sight Belle knew she would treasure forever. "He's perfect," Lucas whispered, gently placing the swaddled infant in Belle's arms. "Just like his mother." Belle traced a finger along her son's tiny cheek. "He has your eyes," she observed, noting the deep blue that would likely darken to match Lucas's own. The years that followed brought changes both expected and surprising. Belle gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth, 2 years after James, and the Double L Ranch prospered under Lucas's stewardship and Belle's increasingly confident management. In 1880, when a fire destroyed much of downtown Walla Walla, including the bank owned by Theodore's father, it was Lucas and Belle who extended credit to help rebuild, asking only fair interest rates rather than the exorbitant terms other lenders demanded. Their generosity earned them the town's lasting gratitude and respect. Even the Walshes were eventually won over, especially after Theodore married a woman from Seattle who encouraged him to make peace with his neighbors. Harriet, finding herself increasingly isolated by her haughty attitudes, gradually softened her stance toward Belle, particularly after Belle organized a successful fundraiser for a new schoolhouse that benefited all the town's children. On a crisp autumn day in 1885, a decade after Lucas had first offended Belle in Harrison's general store, they stood together on the same ridge where he had given her the sapphire pendant. Below them, the ranch sprawled larger and more prosperous than ever, with new barns, expanded grazing land, and a recently built bunkhouse for the increased number of hands required to manage their growing herds. James, now 8, raced across a nearby meadow with his 6-year-old sister, their laughter carrying on the breeze. They were healthy, happy children, secure in their parents' love and blissfully unaware of the social barriers that had once seemed so insurmountable. "Did you ever imagine this?" Belle asked, leaning against Lucas's solid warmth. "That day in the store, when you defended a woman you barely knew?" Lucas slipped an arm around her waist, drawing her closer. "I knew enough," he replied. "I saw a woman with more dignity and strength than all the rich folks in town combined. That was worth defending." Belle smiled, thinking of how far they'd come not just in terms of prosperity, but in the life they'd built together, the family they'd created, and the community they'd helped shape. "Riches never fed a soul," she quoted softly. "You were right about that." "I was," Lucas agreed, brushing a kiss against her temple. "But love can nourish it forever." As the sun began its descent behind the blue mountains, casting long shadows across the land they both cherished, Belle Eldridge Young knew with absolute certainty that the true measure of wealth had nothing to do with money or status. It lay in the strength of bonds forged through understanding and respect, in the legacy of kindness they were teaching their children, and in the enduring love that had transformed two solitary souls into something far greater than either could have become alone. And that, she thought as Lucas took her hand to lead her home, was a fortune beyond counting.